In this video, I want to talk about the muscle that I call the forgotten muscle. What is it and why could it be the key in helping you with any pain throughout your legs and your back? Don't forget guys, if you like our content and it's helpful for you to have tips about your health and well-being, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification and we'll keep you updated whenever we bring out content like this. So, the forgotten muscle is what we term the hip flexors, or to give it its correct term is the psoas or the illacus or the psoas major. So what we have here is a group of muscles that actually originate in the depth of our stomach and they cross the front of the hip. Now, why are these muscles really relevant? Well, let me put a question to you. How do you stretch your hip flexors? Now, you may know the answer to this, but my gut, and if I was to ask 100 people in the high street how to stretch your hip flexors, the answers would be limited. But if I said how do you stretch your quads, or how do you stretch your thighs, or how do you stretch your hamstrings, these are perhaps things that people might be more aware of. What I tend to find is we have these important muscles called the hip flexors that people don't address. But they are hugely relevant in today's society. And I want to explain why they're relevant and why they can be problematic. So we know that these hip flexors originate in the depths of the stomach, but what they actually do is they attach onto our lumbar vertebrae. So we know, although these muscles sit in the front area, they cross the front of our hip. So what happens here is that we can get these muscles to typically become tight. And if we've got tight muscles that are attaching on to our lumbar vertebrae, what do we think the problem is going to be? That we're going to get some lumbar pain dysfunction. But because these muscles we think of being the front muscles, we don't tend to address these when we're dealing with problems in the back. But they can be the forgotten muscle as a result, and the key sometimes to unlocking back pain that might not have been able to be released via other methods if you haven't addressed those hip flexors. But the thing I want to talk about with the hip flexors is why they are so relevant in today's society. And this is because I term that we live in a flexion addicted society. And let me explain that a little bit. As humans, we are really designed to be up, standing and in extension, walking around, hunter, gathering, finding our food. That was our initial design. But over time and in the modern world, we've become addicted to flexion. If you think about sitting on a train or somebody's typical day, it might be that they wake up and they sit at the dining room table while they have breakfast, going into flexion. They then get on a train and they read their phone or they read a paper or a book, and we then live again in flexion for that duration of the journey. They might then arrive at work where they then sit down. What happens when we sit? We sit into flexion. All the time we're using these hip flexor muscles. We then get on the train to go home, repeat the process, drop into the sofa to then carry on watching. Or even if we're working from home, we might then still be spending the day sat in hip flexion. So all the time we're making these muscles tighter. If we put it in a sporting context, when we run, what do? Well, when we run, we hip flex, we lift our legs. So any sport that involves running is going to be using lots of hip flexion. What muscle therefore becomes tight? The hip flexors. We think of a sport such as football. The kicking motion is hip flexion. So again, if you're a footballer, you will have a strong tendency for these hip flexors to become tight. But how much are we stretching out the hip flexors? Probably not a lot. And so as a result, I see lots and lots of hip dysfunction, lower back dysfunction, where we find that hip flexors are being a problem. Because quite simply, we're going against what we're designed to do. So how do we counteract this problem? Well, for me, one of the key things to be doing is to make sure that we are stretching out our hip flexors. We know that we're spending a long time with them in a short and tightened position, and what we really want to then be doing as a result is stretching these tight tissues out. So what I'm going to do here is show you one of my favourite hip flexor stretches where we're really looking to get that hip into extension. Now you can do this kneeling, or you can be doing it standing. But the key thing is that you're trying to factor these stretches into your day as much as possible and holding these for 30 seconds, where really what we're looking to do is to be counteracting the downside of the amount of time that we spend in this flexion addicted society. So I believe these to be a vital muscle in the human body, but probably the most ignored muscle in the human body. Hence why I call the hip flexors your forgotten muscles. So my quick fire tip in this video is, if this sounds like you, if I have described some of the things that you tend to be doing on a typical day, make sure you are putting in this key stretch into your day in order to be making sure that you're not getting the negative effects of these tight hip flexors. Once you have full flexibility, then we can be really working with you to making sure that you can strengthen these to appropriate for their demands. I hope this has been helpful. Did you know how to stretch your hip flexors? Drop me a comment below to let me know. Or have you found since doing those stretches that it's been helping you, or that you had some very tight hip flexors without being aware? Don't worry, you're not alone. Drop your comment and I'll be sure to come back to you.